Knowledge Products presents The Giants of Philosophy, Immanuel Kant, narrated by Charlton Heston. Part 7.
Kant's influence on moral philosophy and modern ethics has been enormous. His moral thought is the classical expression of one of the two great modern moral philosophies. These days, any serious moral thinker is likely to be a Kantian, a utilitarian, or occasionally some sort of combination of the two. The competing philosophy of the utilitarian movement took shape first in the work of Kant's near contemporary, the English reformer Jeremy Bentham. Bentham rooted his moral theory in the following claim.
Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. The standard of right and wrong is fastened to their throne.
The utilitarian views human behavior as a constant effort to acquire pleasure and avoid pain. From this view, Bentham derived what he called the principle of utility, which he says is the basis of all morality.
Utility is that property in any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness, all this comes to the same thing, or to prevent their opposite.
John Stuart Mill, Bentham's successor as leader of the utilitarian movement, also described the principle of utility in terms of happiness.
Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness. Wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness.
The utilitarians thus root their moral ideas in the common-sense notion that it's better to give people pleasure or advantage people than harm or disadvantage them. In other words, utilitarians believe that moral actions should be judged by whether or not they contribute to total human happiness or well-being. Even before this utilitarian doctrine was formulated by Bentham, Kant had rejected its basic premise. Kant acknowledges that human beings have an interest in happiness, but he argues it doesn't follow from this interest that moral life is about the pursuit of happiness.
Morals is not really the doctrine of how to make ourselves happy, but of how we are to be worthy of happiness. One must never consider morals itself as a doctrine of happiness, that is, as an instruction in how to acquire happiness.
Kant simply doesn't believe that moral principles can be based on individual human interests, even the interest in happiness. All interests, including our interests in personal happiness or well-being, express desire, not reason. Although acting according to our interests is perfectly natural, it doesn't for that reason carry any moral weight. For example, sexual lust is a natural desire, but no one supposes it's a basis for a moral principle. In Kant's view, this holds for all our desires. They drive and motivate us naturally, but not necessarily in a moral way. Our desires, even in their highest expressions, always manifest what Kant calls self-love. Happiness is the highest and most respectable form of this self-love. But morality, in Kant's view, is about self-respect, not self-love. Of course, Kant doesn't deny that we feel self-love or that it's natural to seek happiness, but just because the pursuit of happiness is natural doesn't mean it's rational. Sometimes we can do what our reason commands and at the same time serve our interest in happiness. We can be both good and happy. Sometimes, however, the demands of goodness and happiness conflict. When our sense of duty and the pursuit of happiness conflict, we come face to face with our true moral natures. In these hard cases, we learn just what kind of people we really are and discover whether or not we have the right to call ourselves free, rational beings. For Kant, this dilemma is a perpetual one. Regardless of time or place, human beings experience the conflict of reason and desire, or reason and personal interest. The details of the conflict change, but not the underlying issue at stake. Kant describes the unending conflict of reason and desire, or what he calls inclination.
Man feels in himself a powerful counterpoise against all commands of duty which reason presents to him. This counterpoise is his needs, inclinations, or desires, the complete satisfaction of which he sums up under the name of happiness. Now reason issues inexorable commands without promising anything to the inclinations. It disregards and holds in contempt those claims which are so impetuous and yet so plausible, and which will not allow themselves to be abolished by any command.
This situation, Kant explains, creates an internal debate which he calls a dialectic within each of us.
From this, a natural dialectic arises, a propensity to argue against the stern laws of duty and their validity, or at least to place their purity and strictness in doubt, and where possible, to make them accord more fully with our wishes and desires. But this is equivalent to corrupting them in their very foundations and destroying their dignity.
At the heart of Kant's moral philosophy, we find the same basic elements that stood at the center of his theoretical philosophy. Both are rooted in the idea of reason. This is easier to grasp as applied to Kant's theory of knowledge. It seems natural to put reason at the center of discussions about knowledge. But Kant argues that reason's also at the center of our active lives. Any intelligent person reasons about the ends worth pursuing and the most effective means that can be employed to achieve them. But more than that, Kant claims that the ultimate purpose of human action is to express and realize our rational nature. That we are rational means that we have purposes or ends.
Rational nature is distinguished from others in that it poses an end to itself.
We have all sorts of ends, all sorts of things we want or pursue, but Kant says our ultimate end is to realize our own rational nature. As rational beings, we not only have ends, we are ends in ourselves.
The human being is thus fitted to be a member in a possible realm of ends, to which his own nature already has destined him.
We don't simply use reason in acting. In a sense, we are reason. In our purposeful lives, we're the living embodiment of reason as the power that establishes and fulfills ends or purposes. In this sense, says Kant, we're legislators. We create a realm of ends.
As an end in himself, man is destined to be legislative in the realm of ends, free from all laws of nature, and obedient only to those which he gives to himself. His universal maxims belong to a legislation to which he is at the same time subject.
Reason's not simply a tool with which a good life can be built, it's the very substance of a good life. In this idea we see, once again, Kant's great insight that reason is an active, creative force. In his theoretical writings, he describes the creative force of reason to show how it constructs, shapes, gives meaning to experience. In his moral teachings, this same insight becomes the idea that moral experience, the effort to discover and act according to our rational duties, creates our humanity and elevates us above the animals.
Beings who are not rational beings have only a relative worth as means, and are therefore called things. On the other hand, rational beings are designated persons, because their nature indicates that they are ends in themselves, that is, things which may not be used merely as means.
Human life acquires distinction and worth when we outwardly express our rational natures. Rational beings are unique. They possess a unique value.
Such a being is an object of respect. That is to say, a being whose existence in itself is an end. Such an end is one for which no other end can be substituted. Without them, nothing of absolute worth could be found.
We possess special worth not because we're alive, all living things are, not because we can feel pain and pleasure, as countless other creatures do. Human beings have a unique value because they're ends in themselves. That is, because we alone have purposes. Our lives have meaning. We alone, of all creatures, are compelled by our natures to judge and measure the activities of everyday life according to how well they fulfill our aims and purposes. For other creatures, life is just a brute fact, alternately pleasant and painful. For us, life can be a failure, a tragedy, or a success. We take the measure of life. Animals just live. Animals may face challenges or dilemmas, but for them, life never becomes a challenge or a mystery, as it may do for us. Our purposes shape our actions, and they provide a basis for judging our success or failure in performing them. Here, the rational nature of our active lives is most readily apparent. This is true even when our purposes haven't been well conceived. Without a rational nature, we would formulate no purposes at all. We'd have only short-term, immediate goals, like escape from danger or get some food. This sort of animal aim is not really purposeful, because it leads nowhere. The animal finds safety or a meal, but these accomplishments don't become part of the animal's self-consciousness. They don't shape a sense of self or endow his life as a whole with any meaning. But for humans, many rational purposes endure. More than that, we measure and judge ourselves by them. In Kant's view, the highest expression of rational purposefulness is the moral law. The idea of moral law, rather than the idea of happiness, stands at the center of his moral thought.
When one's happiness is made the determining ground of the will, the result is the direct opposite of the principle of morality.
Happiness, as we've seen, is the aim of self-love, but self-love is inherently subjective and individual.
The moral law, however, is objectively necessary, because it holds good for everyone having reason and will. The maxim of self-love merely advises. The law of morality commands.
The moral law embodies the ideal of our rational natures.
The moral law ideally transfers us into a nature in which reason would bring forth the highest good, were it accompanied by sufficient physical capacities. And it determines our will to impart to the sensuous world the form of a system of rational beings.
For Kant, moral law has both a specific and a general meaning. In specific terms, we can say that there are many moral laws. Murder, lying, other acts are prohibited by them. Other actions, such as respecting the rights of others, are required of all those who obey the law. These commands of the moral law are significant only because we're capable of responding to them. That is, only because we take them as commands. Even when we don't obey, we think we're capable of obeying moral law. We feel guilty if we disobey. But for non-rational beings, the commands of the moral law, indeed all commands, are meaningless. They lack the power to recognize what a command is, and they lack the means of responding to one by an active choice. When the early Danish conqueror King Canute thought himself to be master of all he surveyed, he set up his throne on the beach and commanded the tide to withdraw. But the tide washed over his feet, heedless of the king's wrath. The sea couldn't hear and obey the king's command, for the sea has no will. But the moral law speaks to us through our conscience. It commands that we act or refuse to act. We must respond, obediently or disobediently. We're never heedless in the face of conscience. We may be feckless, irresponsible, or stubborn, but never truly heedless. Kant says our conscience is the best evidence that we possess a rational will for whom the moral law is a standard or principle. That we possess such a will is what makes us moral beings at all. The commands of the moral law reveal the reality of human conscience, and they reveal our distinctive human nature. The idea of a moral law is closely related to the idea that we're free, rational beings. This relationship is fundamental to Kant's moral vision. He directly opposes the attitude that freedom must include freedom from laws. This attitude, saying, "Leave me alone, let me do what I want to," regards freedom as a negative condition. Here, freedom means freedom from any restrictions or constraints, but Kant, by contrast, gives freedom a positive meaning.
The intrinsic legislation of pure practical reason is freedom in the positive sense.
For Kant, to be free means to have purpose and a way to realize it. The measure of freedom is not the degree of one's independence from all influence, limitations, and rules. Rather, freedom is the degree to which we have written for ourselves the limitations and rules that give shape and meaning to life. Freedom's not lost when our lives take on a particular shape and design, eliminating alternative lives that we might have led. Freedom's lost only when the shape and design of our lives depends on someone else. We lose nothing in foreclosing options for ourselves. By that we gain solidity and character. We lose freedom only when options are foreclosed for us, when we're denied the power of choice. But just what is this moral law that Kant so closely associates with his ideal of freedom? The answer to this question takes us to the heart of Kant's moral thinking. He champions a freedom that both expresses and is rooted in reason, rather than a freedom expressing our desires and inclinations. It's a freedom of self-mastery, not self-indulgence. To say that moral freedom is rational, however, carries with it many significant consequences. In the first place, the moral law is universal, not merely personal. Moral freedom and moral law are concerned with the organizing rules of moral life. Moral freedom and moral law are productive. They create character or personality, the substance of an individual's existence. Once again, we see Kant's vision of reason as a universal power expressed in rules, a power able to replace chaos with order. Let's consider each feature in turn, beginning with the idea that moral law is universal. In one of his most widely read writings on morality, called The Foundation of the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant emphasizes the universal nature of moral law.
Is it not of the utmost necessity to construct a pure moral philosophy, which is completely freed from everything which may be only empirical and thus belong to anthropology? That there must be such a philosophy is self-evident from the common idea of duty and moral laws. Everyone must admit that a law, if it is to hold morally, that is, as a ground of obligation, must imply absolute necessity. He must admit that the command, "Thou shalt not lie," does not apply to men only, as if other rational beings had no need to observe it. The same is true for all other moral laws, properly so called.
Moral law, Kant holds, is universal. In his view, anything else would be inconsistent with the idea of law. If some rules to count as a law, then it has to apply to everything that falls within its range. Try and imagine a law of gravity that applies to bricks but not to stones, or a traffic law that applies to domestic cars but not to foreign cars. Such rules would produce disorder and disaster, not order and well-being. It's simply part of the nature of laws that they have a universal scope. A moral principle that applies only to some selected group of people has no force as a moral law. As Kant points out, it would carry with it no sense of obligation. Laws that are not universal are not only unfair, but they're incoherent as principles. This incoherence, in fact, is what makes them unfair. Kant explains the underlying principle this way.
The ground of obligation must not be sought in the nature of man or in the circumstances in which he is placed, but sought solely in the concepts of pure reason. Applied to man, moral philosophy gives him as a rational being a priori laws.
Genuine moral principles rise above all the conditions and circumstances of individual existence. They transcend all the biases and peculiarities of personality and culture. They're concerned with the appropriate behavior that's expected of us all. Moral laws or principles are universal. Therefore, they're also necessary. Kant explains it this way.
We can come to know pure practical laws in the same way we know pure theoretical principles, by attending to the necessity with which reason prescribes them to us, and to the elimination from them of all empirical conditions which reason directs.
This is the end of Part 7. Please download Part 8 to continue.